She was 11 years old, barefoot, and standing in the middle of a diner full of strangers, holding two starving children by the hand and asking for nothing more than a chance to work for a meal. The owner said no. The room went quiet. And then one man stood up. What happened next didn't just save three children from starvation. It exposed one of the most corrupt land theft conspiracies in the history of the Oklahoma Plains and changed hundreds of lives for generations. This is Sarah Bennett's story. Stay until the end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Oklahoma sun in July was not the kind of sun that warmed you. It was the kind that punished. It pressed down on the flat, cracked earth like an open hand on a fevered forehead, relentless, indifferent, and completely without mercy. The clay roads turned pale and powdery under its heat. The scrub grass along the fence lines curled inward on itself, as if even the weeds had given up trying to stand tall. But 11-year-old Sarah Bennett had not given up. She never gave up. She walked at the front of a small line of three children moving along the shoulder of a cattle road, the kind of road that didn't appear on any real map, just a worn dirt path that connected one forgotten corner of the county to another. She walked with her chin up, though every muscle in her thin legs ached from a full day of moving through heat that shimmered like water on the horizon. Her shoes, if you could still call them shoes, were held together on the left side with a strip of cloth torn from an old feed sack. The right one had a split along the sole that let the hot dust in with every step. Behind her walked 8-year-old Emily, her little sister, whose face had gone quiet in the particular way that hunger makes children quiet. Not cranky, not crying, just absent, like something behind her eyes had dimmed to save energy. She held Sarah's hand with both of hers, the way she always did when she was too tired to speak, and she matched Sarah's pace without complaint. And behind Emily, moving slowly, always slowly, was 6-year-old Jacob. Jacob was the reason Sarah never stopped walking. He had been sick the previous winter with something the county doctor, on the one occasion they'd managed to see him, had called inflammation of the lung, in a voice that suggested it was serious, but that the family couldn't afford for it to be. Jacob had survived, barely, but he hadn't fully come back from it. His breathing was still labored on hard days, his legs still tired faster than they should. He was small for his age, thinner than he should have been, and the heat today had turned the color in his face to something wrong, too pale in some places, too flushed in others. Still, he walked. He walked because Sarah walked, and Jacob would have followed his sister across burning coals if she asked him to. They had been walking since sunrise. They had knocked on 9 doors. At the first 3 houses, no one had answered. Sarah had stood on each porch and knocked until her knuckles hurt, looking through curtained windows that she was almost certain showed movement inside. She'd knocked anyway. She believed that if someone saw them, really saw them, a girl and 2 small children, they couldn't turn away. She was learning that she had been wrong about that. At the 4th house, a woman had opened the door halfway, looked them over from top to bottom with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read, and said, "We don't have anything to spare," and closed the door again before Sarah could speak a word. At the 5th house, an older man had listened to about 20 seconds of Sarah's carefully prepared speech. She had rehearsed it in her head while they walked, choosing each word, before he held up one hand and said, "I don't know you people." And that had been that. At the 6th house, a teenage boy had looked at them from behind a screen door, called out "Mama" over his shoulder, and then listened to something said in a low voice from inside the house before turning back to Sarah and saying, "She says she's sorry." He at least looked like he meant it. At the 7th and 8th houses, no one answered. At the 9th house, a farmstead with a decent barn and what looked like a real vegetable garden on the south side, a woman in a flour-dusted apron had listened to the entire speech. She had looked at Jacob, looked at Emily, looked back at Sarah. There had been a moment, Sarah had felt it, had leaned into it, where the woman's expression had shifted into something softer. Then the woman's husband had appeared behind her. He'd taken one look at the 3 children on his porch, put his hand on his wife's shoulder, and said, "We can't be taking on charity cases, Mildred." The door had closed. Sarah had stood on that porch for a few seconds longer than she needed to. She had a habit of doing that, standing still after a door closed, as if she was giving the universe a brief window to change its mind. It never did. She turned, took Emily's hand again, and said, "Come on. There's another road about a mile south." People who saw Sarah Bennett in those days, and those who remembered her years later, often described the same thing without knowing each other. They described her eyes, dark brown, almost black in certain light, and set in a face that was still a child's face, round cheeks, a small nose, the softness that even hunger couldn't fully erase from childhood. But behind those eyes was something that did not belong to a child, something watchful, something that had learned to assess a situation in seconds and make calculations that adults twice her age would have struggled with. How safe is this porch? How hungry is Jacob? How much further can Emily walk today? Is this person going to help, or are they going to say no? And if they say no, how do I keep both of them moving when I'm already running out of things to say? She had been making those calculations every day for 4 months. 4 months since their father, Robert Bennett, had sat them down at the kitchen table of the farmhouse they'd grown up in and told them, in a voice that sounded like it had been wrung out, that things were complicated, that there were men with papers and lawyers and county connections, who were saying the land wasn't theirs anymore, that there'd been a debt he hadn't known about, that he was going to fix it. He had not fixed it. He had left on a Tuesday morning saying he was going to the county seat to talk to someone who could help. He'd kissed Sarah on the top of her head, ruffled Jacob's hair, and told Emily her pigtails looked real pretty. He had not come back. Their mother, Clara, had already been gone for 2 years by then, taken by a fever during a winter that had not been kind to anyone in that county. She was buried on the property, beneath a cedar tree at the edge of the east field, in a grave that the children still visited when they could. After Robert left, Sarah had waited 3 days before she admitted to herself that waiting was not a strategy. On the 4th day, she packed what she could into 2 flour sacks, a change of clothes each, a tin cup, a blanket, a small paring knife, and a notebook with a broken pencil stub. And she led her brother and sister out the door of the only home they'd ever known. She was 11 years old. She did not look back. That part wasn't entirely true. She had looked back once, at the cedar tree on the eastern edge of the field, and she had said something under her breath that she never told anyone. But then she had turned forward and started walking, and she did not look back again. The notebook was important. It had been a gift from her teacher, Miss Alderman, who had told Sarah at the end of the previous school year that she was the most naturally precise thinker I've had in 15 years of teaching. Sarah hadn't fully understood the compliment, but she'd understood that the notebook was given with respect, and so she treated it with respect. In it, she had begun, almost automatically, to record things, not feelings. Sarah didn't have much use for feelings on paper. Feelings were something you managed on the inside. You kept them from showing too much on your face, and you certainly didn't waste a pencil stub on them. What she recorded were facts, names of people who turned them away, with brief notes on what they'd said and how they'd acted. Names of men she'd overheard her father mention in the weeks before he left. Men he'd spoken of with a particular tightness in his jaw. Dates. Addresses of places they'd slept in case they needed to return. Descriptions of documents she'd seen on the kitchen table before they left. She hadn't understood them at the time, but she'd copied down what she could read, every word, because Miss Alderman had also told her that information was like food. You didn't throw it away just because you weren't hungry right now. The notebook was tucked against her ribs, inside her dress, where it stayed warm and dry. It was the most valuable thing she owned. By the time they reached the cattle road that ran alongside the main route into the small town of Grady's Crossing, the sun had begun its slow, molten descent toward the western hills, and all 3 children were operating on fumes. Jacob had stopped talking entirely, which was the sign Sarah watched for most carefully. When Jacob talked, he was okay. When Jacob went quiet, things were serious. "How you doing?" she asked him, dropping back to walk beside him. He looked up at her. His eyes were glassy. "My legs feel heavy," he said. "That's normal in the heat. Your body's just conserving." "Conserving what?" "Energy." He considered this. "I don't think I have any left to conserve." Despite everything, Sarah almost smiled. 10 more minutes, she said. "Then we'll find somewhere to sit down." "You said 10 more minutes an hour ago." "I was off by an hour. I'm not perfect." Jacob almost smiled too. "Are we going to eat tonight?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Sarah looked ahead down the road, where the outline of a building, low, wooden, with a hand-painted sign she couldn't yet read, was becoming visible through the heat shimmer. "Yes," she said, "we're going to eat tonight." She said it the way she always said things she wasn't sure about, with exactly enough certainty to keep the others moving. The diner sat at the junction of two cattle roads like it had been dropped there by accident and never moved. It was a small, squat building with a plank porch, two fly-specked windows on either side of a screen door, and a sign that read Fuller's Eat. The word place had apparently fallen off the sign at some point, and no one had bothered to replace it. There were two trucks parked outside, a few horses at a post. The smell of grease and coffee reached Sarah from 30 yards away, and beside her she heard Emily make an involuntary small sound. Not a word, just a sound, the kind a person makes when their body reacts before their mind can stop it. Sarah stopped them at the edge of the road. "Listen to me," she said, and she said it the way she'd learned to say things that mattered, quiet, direct, no softness that could be mistaken for uncertainty. She looked at Emily first, then Jacob. "We walk in there calm. We don't look scared. We stand up straight. I'm going to do the talking, and you're both going to stay right behind me, okay?" Emily nodded immediately. Jacob straightened his spine with visible effort. "Okay. We've done this before," Sarah said. "We've been turned down before," Jacob said, with the blunt honesty that 6-year-olds were sometimes capable of. "Yes," Sarah said, "and we're still here." She took a breath. She opened the screen door. The diner was small enough that every person in it noticed when the door opened. There were maybe a dozen people, farmers, ranch hands, a couple of men in clothes that were slightly better than work clothes, but not quite town clothes. Two women sat at the counter talking to the man behind it, who was presumably Fuller, a large man with a permanently displeased expression and forearms that suggested he'd been doing physical labor for about 40 years. The conversation didn't stop, but it shifted. Eyes moved to the door. Eyes moved over Sarah and the two children behind her. Sarah felt those eyes. She had learned to feel them without flinching. She walked to the counter. "Excuse me," she said. Fuller looked at her without warmth. "You kids lost?" "No, sir. We're not lost." She had rehearsed this too. "My name is Sarah Bennett. These are my brother and sister. We've been traveling and we haven't eaten today. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking if there's any work I can do. Washing dishes, sweeping, anything, in exchange for a meal. I work hard and I learn fast." Fuller looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Jacob and Emily behind her. He looked back at her. "I don't need anybody," he said. "And I can't feed every stray that walks through that door." The word stray landed. Sarah kept her face exactly where it was. "I understand," she said. "Thank you for your time." She turned. Behind her, she heard Jacob let out a breath. Just one short, almost silent exhale. And that sound, that tiny surrendering sound from her 6-year-old brother who had walked all day on tired legs and hadn't complained once, was the only thing that came close to breaking her. She put her hand on his shoulder. She kept walking toward the door. Thomas Hale had been eating alone at the table nearest the window, the one with the best view of the cattle road, a habit from 40 years of watching the land, when the children walked in. He was 63 years old, gray-haired, and built the way men who'd spent their lives in physical work were built. Not large, exactly, but solid in a way that suggested he'd been tested regularly and hadn't crumbled. He wore a plain shirt, worn but clean. His hat was on the table beside his coffee. His hands, wrapped around his cup, were the hands of a man who had never considered himself too important to do hard work. He had watched everything. He had watched the girl walk to the counter with her chin up and her spine straight. This child, this thin, tired, clearly exhausted child. And he had watched her give what was obviously a practice speech, carefully constructed for exactly this kind of situation. He had registered with a particular kind of recognition the preparation behind that speech. You didn't talk like that off the top of your head. You thought it out on the way there, which meant she had been walking toward this door and rehearsing those words for at least the last mile. He had watched the owner say no. He had watched the word stray come out of Fuller's mouth. He had watched the girl's face not change. He had watched the small boy behind her make that tiny sound. And Thomas Hale, who had no particular plan for the evening beyond finishing his coffee and driving home to a ranch that had been feeling very empty since his wife had passed the previous spring, did something he had not consciously decided to do. He pushed back his chair. He stood up. "Hold on just a moment," he said. His voice was not loud. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud. the kind of voice that had spent decades giving instructions that were expected to be followed, and so had never developed the habit of volume as persuasion. Sarah stopped. She turned slowly, carefully, because she had learned to be careful when strangers spoke to her. Thomas was already walking toward the counter. He nodded briefly to Fuller, not warmly, but with the easy familiarity of a man who had been coming to this diner for years and therefore had earned the right to take up some of its space. He pulled 3 bills from his pocket. 3 hot meals, he said. Whatever you've got that's ready. He looked at Fuller steadily. Fuller said nothing for a moment. Then he turned toward the kitchen. Thomas turned to the children. Come sit down, he said simply. He gestured toward his table, the one by the window, the one with the view. Sarah looked at him. She was, in that moment, conducting one of her rapid assessments, the ones that happen in the space of a breath or two, where she measured every available signal, the set of someone's shoulders, the directness or evasiveness of their eyes, the quality of their voice, the small things that people did with their hands, and tried to determine whether this was safety or a new kind of danger. Thomas stood still and let her look. He didn't rush her. He didn't reach for her arm or try to steer her. He simply stood in the aisle of the diner and waited, with the patience of a man who understood that trust had to be offered on the other person's terms, or it wasn't trust at all. Thank you, Sarah said finally. The words were careful, measured. We appreciate the offer. It's not an offer, Thomas said. The food's already paid for. Would be a shame to waste it. Something in her face shifted, almost imperceptibly, but Thomas caught it. She put one hand gently on each of her siblings' backs and guided them toward the table. They ate in near silence at first. Fuller's wife, a woman who clearly ran the kitchen and clearly had more compassion than her husband, sent out plates that were fuller than standard, piled with pot roast and potatoes and biscuits still warm from the oven, and 3 glasses of cold milk that made Emily close her eyes briefly when she took the first sip. Thomas ate slowly and let them eat. He did not watch them the way some people watched hungry children, with pity that was more about the watcher's discomfort than the children's dignity. He simply ate his food, looked out the window at the evening light on the cattle road, and allowed the meal to be what it needed to be. When the edge of the hunger had been taken off, and Thomas could see the precise moment this happened in each child's face, a subtle releasing of tension around the eyes, he asked quietly, "You traveling far?" Sarah set down her fork. She looked at him with those dark, assessing eyes. "We're not sure," she said. "Where are you coming from?" A pause, then, "Our place, west of here." She said it carefully. "Our place, not our home." Thomas noticed the distinction. "Your parents know where you are?" A silence that was its own kind of answer. Jacob looked at his plate. Emily looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Thomas. "Our mother passed 2 years ago," she said. The words were flat and factual. "Our father left 4 months ago to take care of some business at the county seat. He hasn't come back." Thomas was quiet for a moment. 4 months, he said, not as a question. "Yes, sir." "And we've been managing," she said. The word managing carried about 40 pounds of weight that the word itself wasn't designed to hold. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Jacob, who was quietly dismantling a second biscuit with the focused concentration of a child who had learned to make food last. Then he looked at Emily, who had fallen asleep sitting upright in her chair, so gradually, so quietly, that no one had quite noticed the moment it happened. He looked back at Sarah. "How long since you've slept somewhere safe?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. "I keep watch," she said finally. "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "A while," she said. Thomas nodded slowly. He looked out the window at the dark that was now fully settling over the road. He thought about his empty ranch. He thought about the guest rooms that hadn't been used since last Thanksgiving. He thought about his wife, Eleanor, who had told him once, during a conversation he hadn't understood the significance of at the time, that a house with empty rooms had a particular kind of loneliness that was different from the ordinary kind. He thought about a girl who kept watch in the dark so that her brother and sister could sleep. "My name is Thomas Hale," he said. "I have a ranch about 6 miles north of here. It's quiet and it's safe, and there are more rooms than I have use for." He said this plainly, without ceremony. "You're welcome to stay tonight, all 3 of you." Sarah's eyes moved over him again. The assessment. Why? She asked. It was such a direct question, so stripped of politeness, so entirely without pretense, that it startled one of the ranch hands at a nearby table enough that he glanced over. Thomas wasn't startled. He appreciated the question. Because you did everything right tonight, he said, and it still almost didn't work. And I think you already know that's not fair, but you're too busy surviving to have the time to say so out loud. Sarah said nothing, but she didn't say no. Thomas's truck was old but solid, a black Ford pickup that smelled of oil and hay, and the particular combination of leather and dust that accumulated in working vehicles over many years. Emily, still half asleep, was lifted into the cab by Thomas with a matter-of-factness that communicated this is simply what we're doing and prevented the moment from being awkward. Jacob climbed up on his own, slowly, and sat in the middle. Sarah got in last. She sat with her back straight and her notebook. She'd moved it from beneath her dress and now held it in her lap, pressed between both palms. She watched the road ahead through the windshield as the truck's headlights cut through the dark. Thomas drove without speaking for a while. Then Jacob said, "Are you a real rancher?" "I am," Thomas said. "Do you have cattle?" "About 300 head." Jacob considered this. "That's a lot of cattle." "It's a decent number. Do you have horses?" "Several." Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then, with the casual directness of a 6-year-old who had been told to go to sleep by a stranger in a truck on a dark Oklahoma road, "I used to be afraid of horses, but then my dad let me feed one out of my hand and now I'm not." Thomas glanced at him. "Good way to stop being afraid of something," he said. "Get close enough to understand it." Jacob seemed satisfied with this answer. He leaned slightly toward Thomas, not quite against him, but in that direction, and fell asleep within 3 minutes. Sarah watched the road. "I want you to understand something," she said quietly, so as not to wake her siblings. "Go ahead," Thomas said. "We're grateful for the meal, we're grateful for the ride, but I'm responsible for them." She said them the way she'd said "our place," with a weight underneath the word. "I need to know what you expect in return." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He kept his eyes on the road. "I don't expect anything in return," he said. "People always expect something. Some people," he said, "do things simply because they're the right things to do. I won't tell you that's common, but I will tell you it happens." Silence. "Why would you believe that?" Sarah asked. It wasn't challenging, it was genuine. The question of a child who had spent 4 months learning, very concretely, that the world did not reliably operate on kindness. "Because I've seen it," Thomas said. "I've also seen the other kind. Enough of both to know the difference matters." Sarah looked down at the notebook in her hands. "My teacher gave this to me," she said. "She said information was like food. You don't throw it away just because you're not hungry right now." Thomas nodded slowly. "Smart woman." "She was the best teacher I ever had." A pause. "She's the only teacher I ever had." The truck turned north on the cattle road, and the first faint outline of a ranch appeared in the distance against the dark sky. A cluster of lights, low and warm, scattered across the flat land like something that had chosen to stay lit on purpose. Sarah looked at those lights. She looked at Jacob asleep against the door. At Emily curled in the corner of the cab, breathing slowly. She looked back at the road. She did not allow herself to feel relief yet. She had learned through 4 very long months that relief was a luxury with a cost, and that she could not afford to pay it prematurely. But her grip on the notebook loosened, just slightly. And for the first time in 4 months, on a dark road in the middle of the Oklahoma plains, with 2 sleeping children beside her and a quiet stranger at the wheel, Sarah Bennett, 11 years old, barefoot, carrying the weight of everyone she loved in a flour sack and a broken penciled notebook pressed against her ribs. Let herself be carried somewhere, instead of being the one who carried. Just for one night. She told herself it was just for one night. She was almost certainly wrong about that. The ranch appeared out of the darkness the way certain things appear when you've stopped letting yourself hope for them. Quietly, without announcement, as if it had simply always been there, and you were only now allowing yourself to see it. Thomas turned the truck through a wide gate flanked by 2 cedar posts, their wood worn smooth from decades of hands opening and closing the latch. A gravel drive ran between them and the main house, and on either side the land opened up, flat and wide and dark, punctuated by the distant shapes of fence lines and outbuildings, and somewhere off to the left, the low breathing sound of cattle settled in for the night. The house itself was not large by any ambitious standard, but it was solid. 2 stories of whitewashed timber and a covered porch that ran the full length of the front, with a light burning in one downstairs window that cast a long yellow rectangle across the porch steps and onto the gravel below. Sarah looked at that light and said nothing. Thomas stopped the truck and came around to the passenger side. Emily didn't wake when he lifted her down. She only made a small sound and pressed her cheek harder against his shoulder, and Thomas carried her toward the house with the careful steadiness of a man who understood that sleep in a child who needed it desperately was not a thing to interrupt. Jacob climbed down on his own, blinking slowly in the dark, and stood on the gravel looking up at the porch with an expression that was somewhere between wonder and the particular wariness that 4 months of uncertainty had built into all 3 of them, like a second skeleton. Sarah got out last. She stood for a moment with her hand on the truck door, looking at the house. Then she closed the door, put her notebook under her arm, and followed. Inside, the house smelled of wood oil and old coffee, and something faintly floral that Sarah would later learn was the dried lavender that Thomas's wife Eleanor had kept in a ceramic bowl on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, a detail he'd never had the heart to remove. The front room was plain and uncluttered, with 2 armchairs positioned near a cold fireplace, a floor lamp, and a braided rug over bare wood floors. There were no unnecessary things in the room. It was the home of a person who used what he needed and didn't accumulate the rest. Thomas carried Emily up a narrow staircase without ceremony. Sarah and Jacob followed. He put Emily down in a room with 2 beds, with real mattresses and quilts folded at the foot of each, and she sank into the nearest one without fully waking. Thomas pulled the quilt over her and stepped back. "The other bed's for you," he said to Jacob. Jacob stood in the doorway of the room, looking at the bed, like a person who had forgotten that beds existed and was now trying to remember what they were for. Then he walked to it, sat down on the edge, and immediately listed sideways onto the pillow with the complete physical honesty of a child whose body had simply voted to stop. Thomas pulled the quilt over him, too. He and Sarah stood in the hallway. "There's another room at the end of the hall," Thomas said. "Bathrooms between them. There's a towel on the rack, clean. Hot water takes about 2 minutes to run through." Sarah looked at the closed door of the children's room, then back at Thomas. "I don't sleep deeply," she said. It was both an explanation and a warning. "That's all right," he said. "Nothing here requires you to." He showed her the room, smaller than the children's, but with a good window that looked out over the east pasture, and a real bed with real sheets. There was a small lamp on the nightstand, already lit. Thomas stood in the doorway while she moved through the room the way she moved through all unfamiliar spaces, methodically, quietly, cataloging exits and sightlines with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for months without ever being taught that this was what she was doing. "I'll be downstairs if you need anything," Thomas said. Sarah turned. "You don't sleep?" "Not much. Habit." He paused. "Old ranchers and young parents. We both train ourselves out of it eventually." "You have children?" Something moved across his face. Not pain exactly, more like the shadow of a shape that pain had once made, worn smooth by time. "Had a son," he said. "Lost him young." Sarah absorbed this without pressing it. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it in the direct way she meant most things, not as a social reflex, but as an actual statement of fact. "Thank you," Thomas said. And then, because he was not a man who lingered in difficult moments, "Get some sleep, Sarah. You've done enough for one day." He pulled the door mostly closed. Sarah stood in the middle of the room. She stood there for the long moment, listening. She listened to the creak of Thomas's footsteps on the stairs, going down. She listened to the distant cattle. She listened to the sound of the house itself, the way it breathed, the way old houses breathe, settling and expanding in the cooling night air, making sounds that were not threats, but simply the sounds of something solid doing what solid things do over time. She sat on the edge of the bed. She opened her notebook. By the lamp's yellow light, in her careful miniature handwriting, the kind of writing developed by someone who understood that paper was finite, she wrote, "Thomas Hale, Ranch, 6 miles north of Grady's Crossing, helped without being asked, didn't touch us, didn't ask for anything, watch." She underlined the last word twice. Not as a warning, as a reminder. She watched everything. That was how she'd kept them alive. She set the notebook on the nightstand. She lay down on top of the quilt without taking off her shoes. She was asleep in 4 minutes. It was the fastest she'd fallen asleep in 4 months. Morning came in through the east window slow and pale, the way Oklahoma mornings came in summer before the heat gathered itself for the day's assault. Sarah was awake before it. She was always awake before things, which was both her greatest strength and the thing that aged her in ways that had nothing to do with years. She dressed quickly, tucked the notebook under her arm, and went down the stairs. Thomas was already in the kitchen. There was coffee on the stove and something in a cast-iron pan that smelled like eggs, and something else. Bacon, Sarah realized, and the recognition of the smell hit her somewhere below the level of thought, the kind of sensory memory that bypasses the mind entirely and goes straight to the body. Thomas heard her on the stairs and looked up without surprise. "Morning," he said. "Coffee?" "Please," she said, surprising herself slightly with the speed of the answer. He poured a cup and set it on the kitchen table without commenting on the fact that most people did not offer coffee to 11-year-olds. Sarah sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup and said nothing, which Thomas seemed to find perfectly reasonable. They sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Sarah looked around the kitchen slowly. She noticed the lavender in the bowl above the sink. She noticed the row of hooks by the door with 2 hats on them. One worn and working, one slightly nicer, suggesting the existence of occasions that required the distinction. She noticed the calendar on the wall, still open to the previous month, the way calendars in working households often were. Time moved faster than anyone stopped to mark it. She noticed on the kitchen table, half covered by a work glove, a folded document. She didn't reach for it. She just looked. Thomas followed her gaze. He moved the glove, smoothed the document flat, and turned it toward her. "I do a fair amount of business with the county land office," he said, watching her face as she looked at it. "Property records, title transfers, that kind of thing. I know how they work." A pause. "I know how they can be made to work when someone wants them to." Sarah looked up from the document. "You said your father went to the county seat," Thomas said. "Before he left?" "Yes." "Did he say who he was going to see?" Sarah's eyes were very still. "A man named Garfield. He mentioned the name twice. I wrote it down." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Something had shifted slightly in his expression, a focusing, a narrowing, like a man who had spotted something on the far side of a field and was trying to decide if it was what he thought it was. "Walt Garfield," he said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know the first name, just the last." Thomas turned his coffee cup slowly in his hand. He looked at the window. Outside, the morning light was spreading across the east pasture, long and pale and flat, and somewhere out there one of his hands was already moving between the cattle with the methodical patience that livestock required before they'd eaten. "I know that name," Thomas said carefully. Sarah set her cup down. She opened her notebook. She turned to a page in the middle and placed it on the table, rotating it so Thomas could read it. He leaned forward. The page was dense with small, careful writing. Names, dates, fragments of conversation she'd overheard or been told. Document descriptions, property numbers, partial legal descriptions copied from papers her father had left on the kitchen table. A list of men her father had mentioned in the weeks before he left, with brief notations beside each name. Spoke to Papa in town. April. Came to the house. Didn't come inside. Papa's face changed when he said this name. Thomas read without speaking for a long time. When he looked up, his expression was something Sarah couldn't fully read. Not pity, not surprise exactly. Something more like the look of a person who had suspected a certain shape in the dark and had now had it confirmed. "How long have you been keeping this?" he asked. "Since before we left," she said. "My teacher told me information was like food. You don't throw it away just because you're not hungry right now." Thomas looked at her steadily. "Your teacher was right." He looked back at the notebook. "And you've been carrying this for 4 months." "Yes." He was quiet. "Sarah," he said finally, and the use of her name, direct, without decoration, had the quality of a man who was about to say something he'd decided to mean. "There are men in this county who make money from situations like yours. A father who disappears. Children who can't speak for themselves legally. Property with unclear title. These men, they don't break windows, they use paper. They use lawyers and filings and county clerks who owe them favors. They make things look legal when they aren't. Sarah listened without moving. "What's in this notebook," Thomas said, tapping the page gently, "is the beginning of something. I don't know yet what it can prove, but it's a beginning." "Can you help us?" Sarah asked. She asked it the same way she'd asked for work at the diner. Stripped of pretense, direct as a nail, not begging, not performing, just asking the question that needed to be asked. Thomas looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. In the weeks that followed, the ranch became, by degrees that happened too gradually to point to any single moment, something resembling a home. Jacob was the first to soften. He was 6, and 6-year-olds are not designed for sustained wariness. Their bodies and minds are built to reach outward, to explore, to attach. Within 2 days, he had discovered the horses in Thomas's stable with an enthusiasm that suggested his claimed cure of fear had been genuine. And by the end of the first week, he was following Thomas's ranch hand, a quiet Choctaw man named Russell, who spoke little but moved with the economy of someone who had been working with animals his whole life, through the morning feeding routines with the concentrated attention of an apprentice. Russell, for his part, accepted Jacob's presence the way he accepted most things, without comment, without objection, and with the occasional small act of inclusion that communicated far more than conversation would have. He began leaving a smaller version of the grain bucket beside the regular one, at a height Jacob could lift. He showed Jacob once, wordlessly, how to stand beside a horse so it could smell your hand before you reached toward it. He did not praise these demonstrations or check whether they'd been absorbed. He simply did them and moved on, and Jacob absorbed them the way water absorbs into dry ground. Emily was slower to settle than Jacob, but faster than Sarah. She had a quality that was either natural resilience or the particular kind of strength that develops in children who have watched someone braver than themselves model it long enough that it becomes their own. By the 3rd day, she had explored every room in the house with methodical thoroughness and had identified, in Thomas's back office, a shelf of books she could read. By the end of the first week, she had read 2 of them and presented Thomas with a brief, unprompted assessment of each. She liked the first one. She found the second one a little too pleased with itself. And did he have anything about natural history? Thomas looked at this 8-year-old girl who had just critiqued his library with the confidence of a senior academic and went to find her a book about Oklahoma geology that had belonged to Eleanor. Emily read it in 4 days and had questions. Thomas answered what he could, looked up what he couldn't, and told her, with complete sincerity, that she was going to be a formidable person someday. Emily said, "I already am." Thomas didn't argue. Sarah was different. Sarah watched. Sarah took note. Sarah continued to sleep in her clothes for the first 2 weeks, not because she was frightened of Thomas. Her notebook had moved from watch to trustworthy, probably by the 3rd day, which for Sarah was essentially a full endorsement, but because old habits built on survival don't dissolve on a schedule, and Sarah's body had not yet finished consulting with her mind about whether safe was permanent or just the longest stretch of not dangerous she'd managed so far. She helped with everything. She woke early and worked hard and was useful in the specific, unsentimental way of someone who had learned that usefulness was the most honest form of gratitude they had to offer. She helped in the kitchen. She helped mend fence line beside Russell, who seemed to find her company as acceptable as Jacob's. She helped Thomas organize the papers in his office when he mentioned they'd gotten behind. It was while organizing the papers that she found the first real thread. It was a property notice, the kind sent from the county recorder's office to inform a landowner of a title dispute. Thomas had received it 6 months prior regarding a parcel of land adjacent to his south pasture. The land in question had a property number. Sarah stared at that number for a long time. Then she opened her notebook and found the page she'd written on the night they left. The partial property description she'd copied from the papers on her father's kitchen table. The first 4 digits matched. She sat very still for a moment. Then she went to find Thomas. She found him in the barn, examining the hoof of a bay mare with the focused attention he brought to anything that was his responsibility and might be suffering. "Thomas," she said. He looked up. He read her face in approximately 1 second. "What is it?" She held out her notebook, open to the comparison, her handwritten numbers beside the number from the county notice, which she'd brought with her. She didn't explain. She simply held it out and let him see. Thomas straightened up. He took the notebook from her, held it beside the notice, and looked at both for a long moment without speaking. The mare shifted her weight. Outside, a hot wind moved through the space between the barn doors with a dry, whispering sound. "This is your father's land," Thomas said. He said it flatly, as a fact. "I think so," Sarah said. "I'm not certain. But those numbers, the parcel identifier and the county system, they don't repeat. Each one is unique to a specific piece of ground." Thomas looked at her. He had stopped being surprised by what she knew and how she thought about 2 weeks ago. He had started simply listening to her, the way he listened to Russell or his attorney or anyone else who was telling him something true about a situation he needed to understand. "The notice I received," he said slowly, "was from a company called Grady Land Partners. They were claiming right of adjacent acquisition, a legal maneuver that lets a neighboring property holder claim disputed land if the original owner can't be located to contest it." The words "can't be located" hung in the kitchen air between them. "My father," Sarah said, "if he's gone, and if no one is filing on behalf of the estate, then legally, after a certain period, they get the land," Sarah said, "unless someone contests it." Thomas folded the notice carefully and held it in one hand. He looked at Sarah with an expression that had something in it she'd seen only a few times in her life. In Miss Alderman once, when she'd turned in a piece of work that surprised even the teacher. The expression of a person recalibrating their assessment of another person upward. "I want to go to the county recorder's office," Sarah said. "You're 11 years old," Thomas said, not dismissively, just as a fact that had legal implications. "I know that," she said. "You're 63. They'll listen to you." A pause. "They will," Thomas agreed. "And I'll be there," Sarah said, "with the notebook." Thomas looked at this child standing in his barn in the early afternoon heat, holding her notebook against her side, with the light coming in through the barn doors and catching the dust in the air around her, and he thought of many things at once, of his son, gone too young, of Eleanor, who would have known exactly what to say in this moment, of the 40 years he'd spent watching the land around him slowly and deliberately consumed by men who understood that most people were too tired or too scared or too alone to fight back. He thought of a girl who had not stopped fighting since the moment she'd understood that stopping meant losing everything. "All right," he said. "All right?" Sarah asked. "We go Monday morning," Thomas said. "First thing." Sarah nodded. She turned to leave. "Sarah," Thomas said. She turned back. "You're the most remarkable 11-year-old I have ever met," he said. He said it the way he said most things, simply, without decoration, as a statement of observed fact. Sarah held his gaze for a moment. "I'm just paying attention," she said. She walked back toward the house. Thomas watched her go. Behind him, the bay mare exhaled slowly through her nose, and the hot wind came through the barn doors again, carrying with it the smell of grass and distance and the particular quality of Oklahoma summer air that was composed of equal parts beauty and ruthlessness, and had been both of those things for as long as anyone could remember. Thomas folded the county notice into his shirt pocket. Monday morning was 4 days away. He had a great deal of work to do before then. The county recorder's office was a low brick building on the south side of Grady's Crossing's main street, wedged between a feed supply store and a barbershop whose red and white pole had stopped spinning sometime in the previous decade and never started again. It had the particular atmosphere of county government buildings everywhere, the smell of old paper and institutional cleaning solution, the sound of a single ceiling fan moving warm air in slow circles overhead, and the quality of light that came through windows that hadn't been properly washed since the previous administration. Thomas pushed through the glass door at 8:45 Monday morning. Sarah walked beside him, her notebook under her arm. Behind them, at Thomas's suggestion and Sarah's reluctant agreement, Emily and Jacob had stayed at the ranch with Russell. Jacob, because the situation required quiet, and Jacob's enthusiasm for horses had not yet developed a practical sense of occasion. Emily, because Thomas had said, with the careful honesty she'd come to appreciate in him, that what was about to happen might become unpleasant, and unpleasantness of the official variety was something that only needed one witness who could hold her composure. Emily had looked at him with the expression she used when someone underestimated her, a slight tightening around the eyes, a patient compression of the mouth, and Sarah had said quietly, "He's right, Em. Stay with Jacob." And that had been enough. The clerk behind the counter was a thin man in his mid-40s named Delroy Pratt, whose primary professional characteristic appeared to be a carefully maintained expression of bored indifference that Sarah had identified within approximately 4 seconds as the expression of a man who was not actually indifferent but very much wanted people to believe he was. There was a difference, and it mattered. Thomas stepped to the counter. "Morning, Delroy." Pratt looked up. His expression shifted, briefly, just barely, into something that was not quite welcome, but was also not quite the indifference he'd been projecting. Thomas Hale was a man with 300 head of cattle and 40 years of county history. You didn't project indifference at Thomas Hale without a reason. "Mr. Hale," Pratt said, "what can I do for you?" "I need to pull the title history on a parcel," Thomas said. He set a piece of paper on the counter, the property identifier Sarah had matched from her notebook. "This one." Pratt looked at the number. Something happened in his face, small, quick, like a card being turned over and immediately turned back, and Sarah caught it the way she caught everything, filed it, and said nothing. "That parcel's currently in dispute," Pratt said. "I'm aware," Thomas said. "That's why I'm here." A pause. Pratt looked from Thomas to Sarah and back. "Who's the girl?" "She's with me," Thomas said, in a tone that did not invite further inquiry. Pratt pulled the file. He set it on the counter with the particular careful slowness of a man who was doing something he'd been instructed to make difficult, and the original records were there. The deed in Robert Bennett's name, properly filed, properly witnessed, going back 2 generations to a land grant that predated half the county's current infrastructure. Sarah looked at it and recognized her grandfather's name, Daniel Bennett, in the original grant record, and something moved through her that she did not allow to reach her face. Beside it, filed 8 weeks prior, were the Grady Land Partners documents. Adjacent acquisition claim, declaration of owner absence, signed by a county assessor named Harold Birch. Countersigned by an attorney whose name appeared in Sarah's notebook on the page devoted to names her father had mentioned with a particular tightness in his jaw. She laid her notebook open on the counter beside the file. Pratt stared at the notebook. "Where did you get those names?" "I wrote them down," Sarah said. "My father mentioned them before he left. Some of them came to our house. One of them, Birch. I heard on the telephone when I picked it up by mistake, and there was already someone on the line." She said this calmly, factually, the way she said everything. "I didn't understand the conversation at the time. I understand it now." Pratt looked at her with an expression that had moved past the careful blankness into something more complicated. "Young lady," he said, "this is a county legal matter, and—" "I know what it is," Sarah said. She put her finger on the Grady Land Partners filing. "This was submitted on April the 9th. My father left on March the 27th. The claim states he had been absent for a minimum of 90 days before filing. That is mathematically impossible. He had been gone for 13 days. Silence. The ceiling fan turned overhead. Pratt opened his mouth, closed it. Thomas said very quietly, "I'd like to speak to your supervisor, Delroy." The supervisor was a woman named Margaret Fossey, who ran the recorder's office with the kind of competent authority that develops in people who have spent long careers doing essential work without any particular recognition for it, and who have therefore stopped requiring recognition and simply gotten on with the work. She was in her mid-50s, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and looked at Thomas and Sarah over those glasses with an expression that contained, beneath its professional surface, a quality of attention that told Sarah this was a person who actually looked at things rather than looking past them. Thomas explained the situation. Sarah supplemented, when asked, with specific dates and document details, reading from her notebook in the same steady voice she used for everything. Fossey listened without interrupting. She took the Grady Land Partners file and the Bennett deed and laid them side by side and read them with the unhurried concentration of someone for whom documentation was not bureaucratic wallpaper, but actual information. When she finished, she set both documents down and looked at Sarah directly. "How old are you?" she asked. 11, Sarah said. "And you've been keeping these records since when?" "Since before we left the property. About 4 months." Fossey was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Thomas. "This filing date discrepancy is significant. It's fraudulent," Thomas said, without aggression. "Just as a fact." "That's a legal determination," Fossey said carefully. "Then I'd like a legal determination," Thomas said. "I know a man in Tulsa who makes them. He's done work for me before. He's thorough, and he doesn't lose. He paused. I'd like to engage him on behalf of these children. Fossey looked back at Sarah. The property would revert to the estate pending probate, with no guardian of record. I intend to file for emergency guardianship, Thomas said. This week. Sarah looked at him. This was not something they had discussed. Thomas had mentioned the possibility of guardianship once, briefly, in a way that had felt more like thinking aloud than announcing a plan, and Sarah had filed it in the part of her mind she reserved for things she needed more information on before forming an opinion. She looked at him now and found that she did not object. Foes studied them both for a long moment, this gray-haired rancher and this small, still, dark-eyed girl who sat in the chair beside him with her notebook open in her lap like a barrister at a hearing, and something in her expression resolved into a kind of decision. I'm going to flag this file, she said. No further action on the Grady Partners claim until the date discrepancy has been reviewed. She picked up the phone on her desk. I'm also going to make a call? To who? Sarah asked. To the State Property Oversight Office, Fossey said. Because if this filing date was falsified, this isn't the first time and it won't be the last, and that is not a county-level problem. That is a state-level problem. She began to dial. Thomas caught Sarah's eye across the desk. He said nothing, but he gave her a small, single nod, the kind of nod that meant well done in the language of people who were too honest for empty praise. Sarah looked back at her notebook. She underlined Birch's name once. Then she turned to a new page and began writing. The attorney Thomas called was a man named George Caldwell, who drove down from Tulsa in a green sedan 2 days later and sat across from Thomas and Sarah at the kitchen table for 3 hours, while the Oklahoma heat pressed against the windows, and Emily and Jacob played in the shadow of the barn under Russell's distant, reliable watch. Caldwell was 50, compact, with the slightly rumpled quality of a man whose mind ran considerably faster than his organizational habits. He wore a good suit worn carelessly, and he had the eyes of someone who had spent decades looking at documents and the faces of people who didn't want those documents examined. He looked at Sarah's notebook with the expression of a man experiencing a professional surprise. You copied these from memory? He said, pointing to the partial legal descriptions. From the documents while they were on the table, Sarah said. I couldn't take them, but I read them twice before I wrote them down. Caldwell looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the ceiling briefly, as if confirming something he'd already concluded. The date falsification alone gives us grounds for a fraud claim, Caldwell said. If Birch countersigned a document with a false date, knowing it was false, that's not a clerical error. That's conspiracy. He turned to a page of his own notes. Grady Land Partners is registered to a holding company out of Muskogee. But behind that holding company, he pulled a document from his briefcase, is a man named Walter Garfield. The kitchen was very quiet. Garfield, Sarah said. You know the name, Caldwell said. My father mentioned it, Sarah said. She opened her notebook without looking down, turned to the right page by feel, and pointed. Garfield came to the house March 14th. Papa told him the land wasn't for sale. Garfield said, everything becomes available eventually. Papa's hand was shaking when he came back inside. Caldwell read the entry. He read it twice. March 14th, he said slowly. Your father left March 27th. 13 days later, Sarah said. The implication settled over the table like weather. We need to find your father, Caldwell said. I know, Sarah said. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, in plain words, in 4 months. She'd known it the whole time. It had lived in the same place in her chest where she kept the things she couldn't afford to feel until she'd dealt with everything else. But saying it plainly, in a kitchen, to an attorney who was looking at her with the expression of a man taking a statement seriously, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. I'll hire an investigator, Thomas said. Concurrently, Caldwell said. He was already writing. We file the guardianship petition this week, which gives us legal standing. We file the fraud challenge to the Grady Partners claim through Fossey's office, which freezes the property, and we find out where Robert Bennett went and what happened to him. What if Garfield knows? Sarah asked. Caldwell stopped writing. Thomas was very still. What makes you ask that? Caldwell said carefully. Because Garfield wanted the land, Sarah said. And my father left 13 days after Garfield told him everything becomes available eventually, and my father has not come back. She said each of these things with the same flat precision she used for all factual statements, and the flatness was not distance. It was the opposite of distance. It was the membrane between her and something enormous and terrible that she had been maintaining for 4 months. And everyone in the room could see the effort it cost her, and none of them said so, because saying so would have made it harder. Caldwell put his pen down. He looked at Sarah Bennett, 11 years old, 4 months on the road, carrying her family and her evidence and her grief in a notebook pressed against her ribs. And he said, with more gentleness than his professional manner generally permitted, "We are going to find out what happened. I promise you that." Sarah nodded once. "Start with Garfield's movements," she said. "March 25th to the end of April. If there's a paper trail." "There's always a paper trail," Caldwell said. "Then find it," she said. The guardianship hearing was held in the Grady County Courthouse 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning that opened gray and close, with the particular humidity that preceded an Oklahoma thunderstorm by several hours. The courtroom was small and smelled of old wood and lemon polish, and the judge was a woman named Harriet Voss, who had served the county for 22 years and whose courtroom was, by regional reputation, a place where procedural nonsense died quickly and quietly. She was 60 years old, deliberate in her movements, and had the quality of stillness in a chair that belongs to people who have heard enough arguments over enough years to have become entirely immune to performance. She did not need to be performed for. She needed facts. Thomas presented the guardianship petition. Caldwell spoke to the children's situation, the documented absence of both parents, the children's demonstrated self-sufficiency over 4 months, the lack of other viable family. A social worker appointed by the court had visited the ranch the previous week and submitted a report that described the household as stable, safe, and appropriate, and described Sarah in language that Sarah found simultaneously accurate and somewhat startling to hear spoken aloud, as remarkably self-possessed and clearly the primary stabilizing presence for her younger siblings. Judge Voss read the report. She read the petition. She looked over the top of the page at Thomas. "Mr. Hale," she said, "you understand that emergency guardianship is not a permanent resolution." "I understand," Thomas said. "It provides legal standing to act on behalf of the children in matters of property and welfare. It does not replace a permanent arrangement which will require further proceedings dependent on the status of the father." "Understood. And you're prepared for that process?" "Completely," Thomas said. Voss looked at Sarah. "Young lady," she said, "you understand what's being asked here?" Sarah stood up. Thomas had not asked her to stand, and neither had Caldwell, but she stood up because she had decided on the drive to the courthouse that if she was going to speak in this room, she was going to do it on her feet. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said. "Mr. Hale is asking the court to recognize him as our legal guardian while our father's situation is investigated and our property claim is resolved. I support this request." Voss studied her. "Why?" Sarah held the judge's gaze. "Because Thomas Hale is the first adult in 4 months who saw 3 children who needed help and did something about it without asking what he was going to get in return. Because he's using his own money and his own time and his own attorney to fight for land that isn't his and children who are not his blood. And because Emily and Jacob are safe and warm and fed, and Jacob is learning to take care of horses, and Emily is reading everything she can find, and for the first time since our mother died, neither of them goes to sleep afraid." She paused. "That's what Thomas Hale is, Your Honor. That's why I trust him." The courtroom was quiet. Voss looked at Sarah for a long moment. Then she looked down at the petition on her desk and picked up her pen. "Emergency guardianship granted," she said. "Effective immediately." She signed the document. Thomas let out a breath, slow and quiet, the breath of a man who had been holding something tightly and was now permitted to put it down. Caldwell made a note. Sarah sat back down. Under the table, where no one could see it, her hand was shaking, not from fear but from the particular physical release that comes when you have been holding an enormous weight for an enormous amount of time, and someone has finally, officially, helped you carry it. She put her hand flat on her notebook and pressed down until the shaking stopped. The storm that had been building all morning broke over Grady's crossing at noon, as they walked back to Thomas's truck. A real Oklahoma storm, fast and enormous, with thunder that arrived not as a distant rumble, but as a full-body percussion that you felt in your sternum before you heard it with your ears. The rain came horizontally for approximately 45 seconds and then settled into the steady, serious downpour that meant it intended to stay a while. Thomas held his jacket over Sarah's head as they ran the last 20 yards to the truck. She let him, which was itself a measure of something. 4 weeks prior, she would have told him she was fine and gotten wet. They sat in the truck while the rain hammered the roof. Thomas started the engine and turned on the wipers, which did approximately half the job they were designed to do. "Well," he said. "Well," Sarah said. They sat for a moment. "I need to tell you something," Thomas said. He was looking through the rain-blurred windshield at the empty street. "The investigator I hired, Clem Boatner, worked county fraud cases for 15 years before he went private. He called me this morning before the hearing." Sarah turned. "He found your father," Thomas said. The rain was very loud on the roof. "Where?" Sarah asked. Her voice was completely level. "A town called Salters Creek, about 80 miles east." Thomas kept his eyes on the windshield. "He's alive, Sarah. He's in a rooming house. Boatner says he's not well. Not physically, but he's alive." Sarah said nothing for a moment. The wiper blades scraped across the glass in their incomplete arc. "He didn't come back," she said. Not as an accusation, as the statement of a fact she was still in the process of understanding the full dimensions of. "No," Thomas said. "For 4 months." "Yes." She looked at her notebook in her lap. She thought about Jacob's legs aching on the road. She thought about Emily's hands shaking at the diner. She thought about 9 closed doors and 1 stranger who stood up. She thought about all the things she had held, the weight of them, the specific texture of each one, for 121 days. "I want to see him," she said. "I know," Thomas said. "We'll go." "Soon." "As soon as the rain stops." She nodded. Outside, the storm moved across the Oklahoma plains the way Oklahoma storms moved, completely and without apology, filling every available space with water and sound, and the smell of wet earth that was, underneath everything, not unpleasant. It was the smell of the land taking in what it needed after a long dry stretch. The smell of something that had been waiting being finally adequately met. Sarah pressed her hand flat against the cover of her notebook. She looked out at the rain. She did not allow herself to feel everything yet. There was still too much to do, too much to resolve, too many pages left to write. But she let herself feel one thing, one small, specific thing, and that was this. They had not been lost. They had been moving, and now someone knew where they were, and the ground beneath all of it was, for the first time, solid. 121 days. She was still here. They were all still here. The rain stopped by mid-afternoon, and the Oklahoma plains steamed gently in the returning sun, every flat surface giving back its water to the sky in long, pale wisps that drifted upward like the land was exhaling. Thomas drove east on the highway toward Salters Creek with the windows down and the wet earth smell coming through in waves, and Sarah sat in the passenger seat with her notebook open in her lap and wrote nothing, which was unusual enough that Thomas noticed it and said nothing, which was his way of acknowledging it without making it harder. They had left Emily and Jacob at the ranch. This had required a separate negotiation from the guardianship hearing conducted in the kitchen before they left. With Emily positioned at the table with her arms folded and the particular expression she used when she had already identified the flaw in someone else's reasoning and was waiting for them to catch up. "I'm old enough to come," Emily had said. "You're 8, Sarah had said. "Jacob is 6, and he manages fine." "Jacob isn't coming either." Emily had looked at Thomas. Thomas had looked at the wall in the way adults looked at walls when they were declining to get involved in a sibling argument, but also couldn't pretend they weren't in the room. Emily had turned back to Sarah. "You don't know what he's going to be like," Emily had said, and the directness of it, the honest, clear-eyed willingness to name the thing that Sarah was also thinking but hadn't said, had landed quietly between them. "You should have someone with you." "Thomas is with me," Sarah had said. Emily had held her gaze for a moment. Then she'd unfolded her arms and said, "Bring him back," in a voice that was trying to be 8 years old and wasn't entirely succeeding. "I'm not bringing anyone anywhere today," Sarah had said carefully. "Today we're just going to see." But Emily had understood, as she understood most things, what today actually meant. She'd nodded once and gone back to her book, and Sarah had kissed the top of her head. a gesture so rare and uncharacteristic that Emily had looked up in surprise and then walked out to the truck before either of them could make more of it than it was. Now, 80 miles east of Grady's Crossing, with the afternoon sun angling low and gold through the windshield, Sarah closed her notebook and put it in her lap and looked out the window at the flat land moving past. "He wasn't well," she said. "You said Boatner told you he wasn't well." "That's right," Thomas said. "What does that mean, specifically?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the care he used when accuracy mattered more than comfort. "Boatner said he appeared to be in a diminished state, that he'd been drinking, that he looked like a man who'd had something happen to him that he hadn't recovered from." Sarah absorbed this. "Garfield," she said. "Possibly. Boatner's still pulling that thread. If Garfield threatened him—" "Sarah," Thomas said, and something in his voice made her stop. "Let's see him first. Let's see what he says. Your father may have answers we don't have yet." She looked at the road. "He left us," she said. The same flat precision, the same absence of performance. "I know. For 4 months. I know." Jacob could barely walk. Emily was... She stopped complaining about being hungry, Thomas. "Do you know what that means? When a child stops telling you they're hungry, it means they've given up asking because they don't believe it will change anything." Emily was 8 years old, and she had already stopped believing that saying she needed something would do any good. Her voice had not changed its register. It remained level and precise and factual. But something underneath it had shifted, a pressure, like water behind a wall that was beginning to find the seams. Thomas kept his eyes on the road. "You can be angry at him," he said quietly. "I know I can," she said. "And you can also want him back," he said. "Both things are true at the same time. You don't have to sort it out before you see him." Sarah looked at her hands in her lap, at the notebook resting on her palms. She said nothing, but she didn't argue. Salters Creek was smaller than Grady's Crossing, which was itself not large. A crossroads town of maybe 400 people, 2 gas stations, a grain elevator, and the particular quality of quietness that belonged to places that had expected growth and not received it. Clem Boatner met them at the edge of town in a dusty brown sedan, a short, broad man in his late 50s with a gray mustache and the deeply unimpressed expression of someone who had spent 15 years in county fraud investigation and had arrived at a settled peace with the worst of human behavior. He shook Thomas's hand. He looked at Sarah. "You're the one keeping the notebook," he said. "Yes," Sarah said. "Good notebook," he said. Not as flattery, as a professional assessment. The Birch counter signature date was the key. Caldwell's filing that with the state office this week. When the state fraud division gets involved, Garfield's whole operation starts unwinding. He paused. "That's later. Right now." He looked at Thomas. "He's in room 6, back of the building. He knows you're coming. I told him." "How did he take that?" Thomas asked. Boatner was quiet for a moment. "He cried," he said, without inflection, "for about 2 minutes. Then he asked if the children were safe. Then he cried again." Sarah was looking at the rooming house, a long, low building set back from the main road, with a gravel lot and a rusted iron railing along the porch. The kind of building that rented rooms by the week to people who needed somewhere to be while they figured out whether their lives were going to improve or continue in the direction they were already going. She got out of the truck. She walked across the gravel lot. She did not wait for Thomas, who followed at a slight distance because he understood, without being told, that this was not a moment that benefited from company. She knocked on the door of room 6. There was a long pause. The sound of movement inside. Slow, careful movement, the kind made by someone who was not entirely sure of their own steadiness. The door opened. Robert Bennett was 41 years old and looked 60. He had her eyes, the same dark brown, almost black, but where hers were watchful and precise, his were something else entirely. Something that had been watchful once and had gone through a process that watchfulness wasn't designed to survive. His face was unshaved and his clothes were clean. That detail registered. Someone had recently ensured that he was clean and fed, which meant Boatner had been quietly looking after the situation for longer than his professional manner suggested. He looked at his daughter. He said her name. Just her name. One word. In a voice that had nothing left in it to protect itself with. Sarah stood in the doorway and looked at him. She conducted no assessment. She did not reach for her notebook. She did not compose her face into its usual careful arrangement of controlled information. She stood there and let herself look at her father, this diminished, broken, present man. And for one long moment, neither of them said anything. And in that silence was contained 4 months of road dust and closed doors and cold nights and a 6-year-old boy walking on tired legs and an 8-year-old girl who had stopped asking for things she needed. And also, underneath all of it, threaded through all of it, 11 years of a father who had come to school events and fixed the porch steps and sat with her at the kitchen table when she couldn't sleep and called her his best and most serious girl in a voice that had always meant it. "They're safe," she said finally. "Emily and Jacob are safe." He put his hand over his face. "Come inside," she said. "We need to talk." Robert Bennett's story, told over the next 2 hours at the small table in room 6 with Thomas present and Boatner listening from a chair by the door, was the story of a man who had walked into a situation he hadn't fully understood and had been methodically reduced until he didn't know how to walk back out. He had gone to the county seat on March 27th to contest the debt notice, a debt he hadn't known existed, against a lien he'd never signed, executed under a document that bore his signature in ink that was, as Caldwell would later confirm, demonstrably forged. At the county seat, he had been told the debt was valid and the property transfer was in process. He had gone to find a lawyer and had been told by 3 different offices that the matter was already resolved. He had then been contacted by a man who worked for Garfield, not Garfield himself, but a large, quiet man who had found Robert in the boarding house where he'd been staying and had sat across from him and explained in very plain language what would happen to the children if Robert continued to make noise about the property. He had believed this man. Looking at him now across the table, this hollowed-out version of the father Sarah had known, she believed that he had believed it. She believed it not because it excused anything, but because she could see, with the same clarity she applied to everything, that what had happened to Robert Bennett was not cowardice in the ordinary sense, but the specific collapse that occurs when a person is isolated, threatened, and stripped of every mechanism through which they normally function. He had not stopped being her father. He had been made to stop being able to act like one. That was different. It didn't make the 4 months disappear. It didn't give Jacob back his energy, or Emily back her appetite, or Sarah back the 121 nights of keeping watch. Nothing made those disappear. But it made them explicable. And for Sarah, who believed that understanding the shape of a problem was the first requirement of fixing it, that mattered. "The man who threatened you," she said. "Do you know his name?" Robert shook his head. "Could you describe him?" He described him. Sarah wrote it down. Thomas watched this, his ward, this 11-year-old girl, conducting what was functionally a witness interview of her own father, with a precision and composure that would have been remarkable in a trained professional. And he felt something that he did not have an efficient word for. Not pride exactly, because she was not his to be proud of in the possessive sense. Something more like the feeling of watching a thing be fully and completely itself, in the way that certain things, good land, a well-built structure, an honest horse, were fully and completely what they were, without apology and without performance. "Garfield used a man to threaten you," Sarah said, which means Garfield was worried enough about exposure to send someone in person rather than using paperwork. That means the forgery, the lien, the signature, was the weak point. He knew it. Robert looked at her. Something moved across his face, the specific expression of a parent who has always known their child was exceptional and is now confronting the full reality of what that means when it has been tested beyond anything they'd prepared it for. "Sarah," he said. "We have an attorney," she said. "His name is Caldwell, and he's good. The property claim has been frozen. The state fraud office is involved. The date discrepancy in the Grady Partners filing is the opening. Caldwell is using it." She paused. "We're going to get the land back." "Sarah, I need you to come with us," she said. "Not today. When you're ready. But I need you to give a formal statement to Boatner about the man who threatened you, and I need you to do it soon because the window for the fraud challenge has a clock on it, and—" "Sarah," Robert's voice broke on the word. "I'm sorry." She stopped. He was not saying "I'm sorry" the way people said it, as punctuation or social reflex. He was saying it the way a person said something they had been carrying in their chest for 4 months, and had reached the point where the only alternative to saying it was continuing to carry it indefinitely. "I know," Sarah said. "I know," she said again, and this time there was something in it that was not agreement, but was also not absolution. Something more like the acknowledgement that certain things were true and known and did not need to be excavated further right now, because they were all in the same room and the room was small and there was still work to do. She reached across the table. She put her hand on top of his. She did not say anything else. Robert Bennett looked at his daughter's hand on his, small and weathered and steady, and he lowered his head, and his shoulders moved in the way shoulders move when the thing a person has been holding finally comes out of them. And Thomas looked at the window, and Boatner looked at the door, and Sarah sat still and let it happen because she understood, without having been taught it, that some things had to be allowed to move through before you could move forward. They drove back west as the sun went down, painting the Oklahoma sky in the particular colors it reserved for evenings after rain, deep orange and rose and a bruised purple at the edges that faded as you watched it. Robert was not in the truck. He was not ready, and Sarah had not pushed. She had told him where they were, she had given him the address of the ranch, and she had told him, simply, without drama, that Emily and Jacob needed to hear his voice. There was a telephone at the diner in town. She would expect to hear from him. She had said it the way she said things that needed to happen. In the truck, driving west, Thomas said, "You handled that very well." "I was angry," Sarah said. "I know. I'm still angry. I know that too." She looked at the darkening sky. "Is that wrong?" "No," Thomas said. "It's honest. There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment. "He was scared," she said. "Garfield's man scared him badly enough that he just stopped. He couldn't move forward, and he couldn't come back." "Fear does that to people," Thomas said. "Doesn't make it right. But it's real." "He should have been more afraid of what would happen to us without him," she said. Thomas said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. It was true, and it was fair, and it was also the assessment of an 11-year-old girl who had been more capable in 4 months of crisis than most adults would have been, and who therefore had some legitimate standing to make it. They drove in silence for a while. Then Sarah said, "Caldwell needs to depose Garfield." Thomas glanced at her. "Directly," she said. "Not his attorneys. Not through filings. Garfield himself, under oath, about the date of the filing and the forgery. Because men like Garfield, they build structures around themselves so they never have to be in the room where the accountability is. They use paper and intermediaries and legal maneuvers so that everything bad happens at a distance from them personally." She paused. "We have to get him in the room." "Caldwell may already be planning that," Thomas said. "Tell him I said it needs to be the priority," Sarah said. Thomas almost smiled. "I'll tell him," he said. Sarah turned back to the window. The last of the sunset was fading at the horizon, going deep red and then dark, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the east. Faint at first, then brighter, the way they always appeared, one at a time and then all at once. She thought about Emily at the table with her arms folded. She thought about Jacob and the horses. She thought about her mother's grave under the cedar tree at the east edge of a field that still, legally, had their name on it. She thought about a notebook that had started as a gift from a teacher who believed in the value of paying attention and had become, improbably, necessarily, the instrument through which a family's stolen future was being reclaimed. She opened the notebook. In the last of the fading light, she wrote, "Day 122. Found Papa. He is alive. The property claim is frozen. Garfield's name is on the document. We are going to get the land back." She paused. Then she wrote one more line. "We are going to be okay." She hadn't written those words before. In 4 months of detailed, factual, precision-committed record-keeping, she had not once written anything that was not a verifiable fact. She looked at the words. She decided they qualified. The hearing at which Walter Garfield was compelled to testify took place 6 weeks later in the Tulsa County Courthouse, a larger stage than Grady County, with a senior state fraud investigator seated at the prosecution table alongside Caldwell, and to the right of the investigator, a narrow-faced assistant from the state attorney general's office who had taken a particular interest in the case once the scope of Grady Land Partners' operations had begun to emerge. Because it was not, as Caldwell had suspected and Sarah had recorded in her notebook with grim, unsurprised precision, just the Bennett property. There were 11 other parcels, 11 other families, most of them with circumstances similar to the Bennetts, fathers gone or incapacitated or frightened off, properties transferred through fraudulent filings, the legal mechanisms of ownership quietly turned against the very people they were supposed to protect. 11 families who had lost land that had belonged to their parents and grandparents through a system that had been operating for at least 7 years and had acquired for Walter Garfield's holding company, by conservative estimate, according to the state investigator, land valued at considerably over $2 million. When Sarah had learned the scale of it, she had sat at Thomas's kitchen table for approximately 60 seconds in complete silence. Then she had opened her notebook and written, "Not just us. Find the others. Caldwell had found them." The day of the hearing, Sarah sat in the gallery with Thomas on one side and her father on the other. Robert Bennett, who was not the man he had been before March, and might not ever be entirely, but who had come to the ranch 2 weeks after Salters Creek, thinner and unsteady but present, and who had sat with his children in the kitchen of Thomas Hale's house and said he was sorry in the specific, non-negotiable way that required no response other than being heard. Jacob had crawled into his lap immediately. Emily had waited 4 minutes before doing the same. Sarah had sat across the table and watched her family with the notebook closed in front of her and her hands flat on the cover. She had let herself feel it then, all of it. Quietly, without performance, in the kitchen of a man who had stood up in a diner for 3 hungry children because it was the right thing to do. Now she sat in the Tulsa County Courthouse gallery and watched Walter Garfield take the stand. He was 65 years old and carried himself with the specific confidence of a man who had spent decades operating just far enough inside the edges of legality to believe he was untouchable. He was well dressed. His attorney was better dressed. He answered the first several questions with the smooth, unhurried competence of someone who had been deposed before and understood that the goal was not to answer questions, but to provide answers that sounded like answers while containing as little actual information as possible. Then Caldwell stood up, and Caldwell put the Bennett deed on the table, and beside it he placed the Grady Land Partners filing, with the date circled in red, and beside that he placed a notarized statement from Harold Birch, the county assessor who had countersigned the filing. Birch, who had been the first to cooperate with the state investigation once it became clear that the alternative was a fraud conspiracy charge carrying a potential prison sentence, and who had signed a statement confirming that the date on the document had been, at Garfield's direction, altered from the actual filing date. And beside that, at the far end of the table, placed last, with the particular precision of someone who understood the value of sequence, Caldwell placed a copy of a single page from Sarah Bennett's notebook, the page with her father's date of departure, the page with Garfield's name and the words, "Everything becomes available eventually," the page that had started everything. Garfield looked at that page. For the first time in the hearing, his expression changed. "Mr. Garfield," Caldwell said, "I'd like to direct your attention to this document." What followed lasted 4 hours. Sarah watched every minute of it without moving from her seat. She watched Garfield's attorney object 17 times. She watched the judge sustain 4 of those objections and overrule 13. She watched Garfield's composure, that polished, practiced, decades-built composure, develop hairline fractures under Caldwell's questioning, small failures of certainty and answers that should have been certain, hesitations where there should have been fluency. She watched the state fraud investigator make notes with increasing speed. She watched the assistant from the Attorney General's office lean forward in his chair. She watched the room understand what she had understood 6 weeks ago in Thomas's kitchen, that Walter Garfield had built his entire operation on the certainty that the people he stole from had no resources, no standing, and no one willing to stand beside them. He had been wrong. He had been wrong because an 11-year-old girl had paid attention, because a teacher had given a notebook to a student she believed in, because a rancher had stood up from a table in a diner on a hot July afternoon, because information kept carefully and carried faithfully had waited, the way her teacher had told her it would wait, for the moment when someone was hungry enough for it. Walter Garfield was indicted on 14 counts of property fraud and 2 counts of criminal conspiracy before the end of the month. Harold Birch's cooperation agreement became the cornerstone of a statewide investigation that would take 2 more years to fully resolve. The Bennett property was formally restored to Robert Bennett's name 93 days after the hearing. The night they got the call from Caldwell confirming the restoration, Sarah sat on the porch of Thomas's ranch house in the warm August dark and looked out at the flat land and the stars above it and held her notebook in her lap. She opened it to the last page of writing. "We are going to be okay." Below it, she wrote the date. Below the date, she wrote, "We were right." She closed the notebook. The Oklahoma night was warm and full of the sound of cattle and the distant call of something in the grass and the particular deep quiet that existed between those sounds. The quiet that belonged to land that was still there, still solid, still carrying the weight of everything that had happened on it, and remaining, despite all of it, exactly itself. Sarah sat in it for a long time. She did not feel the need to move. The Bennett property in autumn looked different than it had in spring. That was what Robert noticed first, driving the familiar road toward the farmhouse on the morning they returned. That the land had continued being itself while they were gone, indifferent to the legal battles being fought over it, indifferent to the human machinery of fraud and restitution and courtroom hours. The east field had gone gold with the season. The cedar tree at its edge had deepened in color, its branches full and dark against the pale October sky, and the grass around Clara Bennett's grave had grown up lush from the summer rains, as if the earth had been quietly tending to her in the absence of anyone else to do it. Robert stopped the truck at the edge of the field. He sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, looking at the cedar tree. Jacob, in the back seat, leaned forward between the front seats and looked too. "Mama's tree got bigger," he said. "Trees do that," Robert said quietly. "Even when nobody's watching?" "Especially then," Robert said. Sarah, in the passenger seat, said nothing. She was looking at the farmhouse, still standing, its windows intact, its porch boards gray with weather but solid. Someone, at some point in the proceedings, had padlocked the front door. The padlock was gone now. Caldwell had arranged for its removal the previous week, along with a formal letter from the county recorder's office confirming restoration of title, which Sarah had read 3 times and then placed in her notebook between 2 pieces of cardboard she'd cut from a cereal box to protect it. She got out of the truck. She walked across the grass to the porch. She stood with her hand on the doorframe and looked at the front door, the same door she had walked out of on a Tuesday morning in late March, with 2 flour sacks and 3 children and the particular quality of resolve that forms in a person when they have run out of options for anything other than forward. She pushed the door open. The house smelled of dust and closed air, and something underneath those things, wood and old meals and the specific combination of a particular family's years, lived in a particular space that was not quite smell but was something the body recognized before the mind could name it. "Home," the body said, without consulting anyone. "This is the place." Emily came up behind her and stood in the doorway. Then Jacob. Then Robert, last, moving slowly, with the careful deliberateness he'd developed since Salter's Creek. Not timid, exactly, but aware of his own weight in a way he hadn't been before, as if he'd learned to step more carefully after learning how much damage a fall could do. They stood in the front room of their house. "It's smaller than I remembered," Emily said. "You got bigger," Jacob told her, with the authority of someone who considered this an obvious explanation. "We both did." "I got bigger faster." "You absolutely did not. Russell said I grew half an inch since—" Russell was being kind. Robert made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, something between them that had the quality of both, pressed together into a single involuntary note. He put his hand over his mouth. Then he lowered it and looked at his children and said, "I'm going to fix this place up. Everything that needs fixing." "The porch steps," Sarah said immediately. "The porch steps," he agreed. "The back window latch. It never closed properly." "I know." "The ceiling in Emily's room has a soft spot." "Sarah," Robert said. She looked at him. "I know," he said. "I'll fix all of it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and walked into the kitchen. They did not move back all at once. This was Sarah's decision, made practically and without sentimentality, in the way she made most decisions. The house needed work before it was properly livable. The months of vacancy had not been kind to the plumbing, and there was a section of the back wall where rain had gotten in through a damaged section of roof and produced a creeping damp that required attention before winter. Robert was capable of most of these repairs, but not at the speed the calendar required, and Thomas had sent 2 of his ranch hands, including Russell, who worked on structures with the same quiet competence he applied to everything, to help for the first 2 weeks. So they spent those 2 weeks in a kind of half-life between the ranch and the farmhouse, working on the property by day, returning to Thomas's in the evenings, eating at his table, and sleeping in the rooms that had become, over 4 months, something that felt more than temporary. It was during this period that something happened that nobody planned and everybody later agreed was probably inevitable. Thomas began to struggle. It was Jacob who noticed first, because Jacob had developed, through months of following Russell around the ranch and paying the kind of close physical attention that young children paid to things they cared about, a sensitivity to the states of the people around him that was unusual for a 7-year-old. He noticed the way Thomas sat at breakfast on the 3rd day of the repair work and didn't finish his coffee. He noticed that Thomas had taken 2 aspirin the previous evening and had gone to bed an hour earlier than usual. He noticed most acutely that Thomas's color was not right in the way that Thomas's color was usually right. That particular quality of steady, weathered health that had been one of the first things Jacob cataloged about him, he told Sarah. She looked at Thomas that evening at dinner with her assessment eyes, and she saw what Jacob had seen, and she also saw something else. The specific way Thomas was carrying himself, the very slight forward lean, the occasional pause mid-sentence that was not the pause of a man choosing words, but the pause of a man managing something physical that he was not going to mention, because mentioning it was not in his nature. "Thomas," she said, after dinner, when Emily and Jacob were washing dishes and Robert was on the back porch looking at the stars with the private quality he sometimes had in the evenings. Thomas looked up from the paper he was reading. "When did you last see a doctor?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. "I'm fine," he said. "That's not what I asked." A pause. "June, I believe." "It's October." "I'm aware of the month, Sarah." "You haven't been sleeping well. Your color is off. You've been taking aspirin every evening for 4 days and you haven't told anyone." Thomas set the paper down. He looked at her with the expression he used when she had caught him at something he'd been hoping wasn't visible. "I didn't want to concern anyone," he said. "Not concerning people by not telling them things," Sarah said, "is a strategy that has a very specific history of not working out." She paused. "In my experience," he almost smiled. "I'll make an appointment," he said. "Thursday," she said. "I already called. 2 o'clock. I'll drive." Thomas looked at her. "You're 11 years old." "I'll be 12 in March, Thomas." She looked at him steadily. "Please go." He went. The doctor in Grady's Crossing was a man named Featherstone, who had been practicing general medicine for 30 years, and who told Thomas, after an examination that was thorough enough to suggest he took the situation seriously, that Thomas had a heart arrhythmia that had probably been developing for some time, and that was eminently treatable, but required medication and monitoring, and a reduction in the specific kind of physical overwork that Thomas had been conducting every day for 40 years. Thomas sat in the examination room and listened to this with the same expression he brought to most difficult information. Not denial, not alarm, but the quiet, focused attention of a man taking inventory of what was true so he could figure out what to do about it. In the car on the way home, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I need to hire more help at the ranch." "Yes," Sarah said. "Russell can take on more supervision." "He can. He will. You should tell him." "I'll tell him." Silence. "Are you frightened?" Sarah asked. Thomas considered the question with the respect it deserved. "A little," he said. "Mostly I'm irritated. I had plans." "Your plans haven't changed," Sarah said. "They just require you to still be alive to carry them out. The medication helps with that." He looked at her sideways. "You sound like Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he'd said his wife's name directly to Sarah, without the careful circumlocution he usually employed around it, and the directness of it seemed to surprise him slightly, even as he said it. "Was she right often?" Sarah asked. "More often than was strictly comfortable," Thomas said. Then I'll take that as a compliment, Sarah said, and turned back to the road. The Bennett farmhouse was ready by mid-November, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, and the children moved home in the way that children moved between places they had grown attached to, with the ambivalence of those who have learned that belonging somewhere does not require belonging only there, that home was not necessarily a single fixed location, but could be a collection of people and places that held you in different ways. Robert met them on the porch on the day of the move. He had painted it. Not perfectly. There were places where the brush had been hasty, and he was not, as a painter, particularly gifted, but with thoroughness, every board covered, the porch steps solid and repaired beneath the fresh coat of gray paint that matched the original as closely as he'd been able to manage. He had replaced the back window latch. He had addressed the ceiling in Emily's room. He had done all of it with the focused, slightly desperate energy of a man who understood that repair, at this point in his life, was not metaphorical. Emily inspected the ceiling first. "You patched it properly," she said, sounding mildly surprised. "Thomas's man showed me how," Robert said. "You should have asked him years ago." Sarah said, without heat. Emily looked at the ceiling a moment longer. "It's good," she said. "Thank you, Papa." Robert nodded. He cleared his throat. He looked at Jacob, who was running his hand along the newly painted porch railing with the expression of someone conducting a quality assessment. "Well," Robert said. "Solid," Jacob reported. "Russell would approve." "High praise," Robert said. "The highest," Jacob agreed seriously. They moved their things inside. That evening, Robert cooked dinner. He was not a skilled cook and had never claimed to be, but he had spent several weeks quietly practicing, with the assistance of a handwritten recipe card that Thomas's housekeeper had given him, and the result was a beef stew that was not technically sophisticated but was hot and filling and made with the specific quality of attention that transforms ordinary food into something else. He set the table properly, with the good plates that Clara had kept in the back cabinet and that Robert had washed twice to make sure. They sat down, the four of them, at the kitchen table of their house. For a moment, nobody spoke. There was something in the room, not quite weight, not quite lightness, but something between them, the particular atmosphere of a moment that all four of them recognized, in their own ways, as significant without being able to say entirely why. "Jacob," Emily said finally, "your elbow is in my space." "My elbow is in my space," Jacob said. "Your elbow is objectively—" "Children," Robert said. His voice was soft. They looked at him. He looked at them. All three of his children, at his table, in his house, at the end of a year that had been the worst and strangest and most clarifying year of his life. He looked at Emily with her chin up and her opinions already forming about something. He looked at Jacob, who had grown perceptibly since March, and whose color was better than it had been in a long time. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him with those dark eyes that saw everything and recorded everything, and had, over the past months, slowly and partially permitted themselves to do something they had not done in a very long time, which was simply look at her father without calculating whether he was safe. "Thank you," he said. He said it to all three of them, simply, without explanation, because they all knew what was being thanked. Sarah picked up her fork. "Eat," she said. "Before it gets cold." Thomas came to Thanksgiving. This had not been formally discussed or invited. It had simply become apparent, through the gradual logic of the preceding months, that Thanksgiving at the Bennett farmhouse without Thomas was an arrangement that did not make internal sense. And so, on the Thursday morning of the holiday, Robert drove to the ranch and collected him. And Thomas arrived with a pie that his housekeeper had made, and a bottle of cider, and the slight awkwardness of a man who was not accustomed to being included in other people's family occasions, which he covered by immediately finding something useful to do in the kitchen. Russell came too, at Jacob's specific and direct invitation, which Jacob had extended by walking to the bunkhouse at the ranch 3 days prior and saying, "You're coming to our Thanksgiving because you taught me about horses, and that means your family," in the tone of someone for whom this was a logical conclusion rather than a sentiment. Russell had said, "All right," with approximately the same inflection he used when agreeing to fix a section of fence. He brought nothing and said little and ate more than anyone and helped clear the table without being asked, and Jacob sat next to him the entire meal with the satisfied expression of a child whose world has been organized to his specifications. They ate at the big table that Robert had brought up from the cellar, and opened to its full extension for the first time in years. The food was abundant in the imperfect way of meals cooked by multiple people with different skill levels and no coordinated plan. Emily had made biscuits that were technically flawless. Jacob had been in charge of butter, a responsibility he had taken with complete seriousness. Robert's turkey was correctly cooked and correctly seasoned and had been the subject of significant private anxiety for 4 days. Thomas ate his second serving and said it was the best turkey he'd had in years, which Robert received with the expression of a man who knew he was being generously assessed, but was grateful for the generosity. "Is that true?" Sarah asked Thomas quietly, when Robert was across the table talking to Russell about fence work. "The turkey is fine," Thomas said. "The company is the best I've had in years. That part is true." Sarah looked down the table at her father and Russell, at Emily explaining something to Jacob with the patient authority she'd developed around him, at the plates and the glasses, and the particular quality of noise a table made when the people at it were not performing for each other but simply being together. She looked back at Thomas. "Are you all right?" she asked. She asked it the way she asked things she actually needed to know the answer to. "I am," Thomas said. And then, because she was watching him with the eyes that required honesty, "Better than I've been in some time." "The medication is helping." "The medication is helping," he said, "and other things." She didn't ask what other things. She understood. She picked up her glass. Thomas picked up his. They didn't make a toast. Neither of them was much for ceremony. But they looked at each other for a moment across the table, and in that look was contained something that didn't require words. The acknowledgement of a year that had been, in its way, one of the most consequential either of them had lived, and the recognition that it had been consequential because they had moved through it together, and that together was not something either of them had expected to find on the other side of the separate losses they'd carried into that July afternoon, in a diner on a cattle road. They set their glasses down. Robert started telling a story about the fence posts and made it funnier than it probably was, and Emily corrected one of his details with the precision of someone who had been there, and Jacob laughed at the wrong moment and then laughed again at his own mistiming, and Russell's expression, which was in most circumstances as still as resting water, shifted briefly into something that on another face would have been a grin. The table was full. The years that followed moved the way years moved when the ground beneath them was finally solid, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary accumulation of hard seasons and personal reckonings that any life gathered over time, but with the quality of direction that had been absent before. Things grew. Things changed. And the changes, even when they were hard, happened to people who knew where they stood. Robert Bennett rebuilt the farm through the following 3 years with a methodical persistence that was perhaps the truest form of amends available to him. He was not the man he had been before March. That man was gone, dismantled by a combination of threat and shame and the specific collapse of someone who had believed that loving his children was the same thing as protecting them, and had discovered the hard way that it was not. But the man he became in the aftermath was, in certain ways, better. More present, more deliberate, more aware that the things worth having required the courage to stay in the room when staying was hardest. He planted the east field again in the second spring. He tended Claire's grave with a regularity that required no schedule because it required no reminder. He did not drink again. Jacob grew in the way Jacob grew, outward and upward, and with an enthusiasm for living things that had been in him since before the hard year and simply intensified afterward. He grew up on 2 properties, the farmhouse and the ranch, moving between them with the ease of a child who had learned that belonging was not zero-sum. He worked with horses through his teenage years with a skill that surprised no one who had watched him in those first weeks with Russell. At 18, he enrolled in an agricultural college on a scholarship that Thomas helped him apply for, and he studied animal science with the focused joy of someone who had found the thing they were meant to do and recognized it immediately. He came home every summer. He always arrived at Thomas's ranch first. Emily became a teacher. This surprised no one who had been paying attention. She had been a teacher since approximately age 7. The drive to explain things, to pass information from where it was to where it needed to be, had always been as fundamental to her as breathing. She was certified at 21 and placed in a school in Grady's Crossing, where she discovered that what she was best at was not the children who came prepared and eager, but the children who came from circumstances that had stripped their eagerness away, the hungry children, the frightened children, the children who had decided that the world did not reliably deliver what they needed and had therefore stopped asking. To those children, Emily Bennett gave the particular gift of someone who knew from the inside what that decision felt like and had come out the other side of it. She did not pity them. She did not perform compassion for them. She simply showed up every day with the same expectation she held for all her students and the additional private knowledge that expectations were themselves a form of belief, and that being believed in, when you had gone without it, was one of the most powerful things one person could offer another. She taught in Grady's Crossing for 11 years. Then she opened a school of her own, and Thomas Hale's health, tended by medication and monitoring and the specific quality of purpose that comes from being needed, stabilized, and held. He did not reverse 40 years of hard physical life. No medication accomplished that. But he lived within the limits Featherstone set, with the cooperation of a man who had decided that living was something he intended to continue doing for reasons that had multiplied considerably since a July afternoon in a diner where he had pushed back his chair and stood up. He sold portions of his cattle operation in the third year at Featherstone's recommendation and hired a full-time manager for the day-to-day, and found, to his own mild surprise, that the reduction in physical labor created space for other things. He attended more of Emily's early school events than was strictly necessary. He drove to Jacob's College for 3 of Jacob's 4 years to watch the livestock competitions. He had dinner at the Bennett farmhouse so regularly that Robert had simply assigned him a chair. He was not the children's grandfather. He had never tried to be their grandfather, any more than he'd tried to be their father. He was Thomas Hale, the rancher who had stood up, and that was a specific and irreplaceable thing that did not need a family title to carry its weight. But when Jacob's college competitions went well, it was Thomas he called first. And when Emily had a difficult week in her first year of teaching, it was Thomas's kitchen table she came to on Friday evenings. And when Robert needed help with the east field fence in the 4th spring and his back went out on the second day of the project, it was Thomas who drove over with Russell and spent the afternoon on a fence line that was not his, in a field that was not his because it needed doing and he was there. These things were not grand. They were not the stuff of courtrooms or fraud indictments or state investigations. They were the ordinary texture of a life lived in proximity to people you had chosen to remain responsible for. And Thomas understood them, in the part of himself that had always understood the things that mattered without requiring them to be announced as the best work he'd ever done. Sarah was 19 when she first sat across a desk from a family she'd been called in to help. She was not yet formally credentialed. That came later, after a degree in social work from the University of Oklahoma that she completed in 3 years by taking every available course load and writing her thesis on the legal mechanisms by which property fraud disproportionately targeted families without legal representation. The thesis cited 11 specific cases from the Garfield investigation. It was read, in its draft form, by George Caldwell, who sent her a note that said, "This is the best analysis of the systemic problem I've seen. You should publish it." She published it the following year in a state law review journal. She was 21, but at 19, before the degree, before the thesis, before any of the formal apparatus of a professional life had been assembled, she was working as a volunteer advocate in the Grady County Legal Aid Office, reading files, helping families organize documentation, sitting in on intake interviews, doing the things she had been doing since she was 7 years old, which was paying attention and writing things down. The family she sat across from that day was a woman named Darlene Price and her 3 children, a girl of about 12, a boy of 9, a small girl of 4 who stayed pressed against her mother's side the entire interview, and looked at Sarah with the specific quality of watchfulness that Sarah recognized from her own mirror. Darlene was trying to explain a property notice she'd received. Her husband was gone, not in the way Robert had been gone, but gone in the more permanent and less complicated sense of a man who had decided his family was not his responsibility and had removed himself accordingly. The notice was from a company Sarah had never heard of, but the structure of it, the language about adjacent acquisition, the reference to an absent owner, the carefully ambiguous claim about title dispute, she recognized in approximately 30 seconds. She asked Darlene if she could see the notice. She read it twice. She opened her notebook, a newer one, the third she'd filled since Miss Alderman's gift, same format, same careful handwriting in the same small, precise letters. And she wrote down the company name, the filing date, the property identifier, and the name of the county assessor who had countersigned. She looked up. "I'm going to need you to tell me everything you remember," she said. "Names, dates, conversations, anything your husband said about the property in the months before he left. Anything that seemed unimportant at the time is important now." Darlene looked at her, this 19-year-old girl across the desk with her notebook and her careful eyes, with the expression of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time and has just been offered, for the first time, the possibility that they might not have to carry it alone. "Where do I start?" Darlene asked. "At the beginning," Sarah said, "and don't leave anything out." She wrote for 2 hours. The Bennett Ranch Refuge. It was called that from the beginning, though the name was Emily's idea, suggested at a kitchen table conversation in the 7th year with the casual certainty she brought to good ideas, did not begin as a formal institution. It began, as most true things began, with a specific need meeting a specific capability without any particular plan. It began with a child, a boy of 8 named Marcus, found by Robert on the edge of the East Road in the 5th year. Thin, alone, with the look Sarah recognized on sight because she had seen it in a mirror for 121 days. Robert brought him home without much deliberation, because by that point bringing home a child who needed shelter was simply what the Bennett farmhouse did, in the way that certain places took on, over time, the character of the people who had lived in them. Marcus stayed for 3 months. During those 3 months, 2 other children came, one brought by Darlene Price, whose own situation had been resolved through the legal aid office and who had begun, in the way of people who had been helped and understood what helping had meant, to bring others. One found by Thomas, sitting alone outside the diner at Fuller's Eat on a Tuesday afternoon with no shoes and a paper bag of belongings. Sarah looked at these children and understood what was happening before it had a name. She called a meeting at Thomas's kitchen table. Thomas, Robert, Emily, Jacob, who was home for the summer, Russell, and Caldwell, who drove down from Tulsa because Sarah had asked him, and he had learned over 7 years that when Sarah Bennett asked you to a meeting, you went to the meeting. "We have a ranch that has more space than we're using," Sarah said. "We have people who know how to run it. We have an attorney who knows the legal structure for a charitable organization. We have a social worker." She nodded at herself because she had just passed her licensing exam the previous month. "And a teacher." She nodded at Emily. "And 2 experienced ranchers, Thomas and Robert. And a person who is better at the practical work of caring for animals and children than anyone else I know." She looked at Russell, who received this without visible reaction. "And we have a reason," she said. She looked around the table. "We all know what it means to be the family that needed someone to stand up, so." She put her hands flat on the table. "Let's build the place that stands up." There was a silence. Then Jacob said, "I'm in," with the promptness of someone who had been waiting for the question. Emily said, "Obviously," in the tone she used when something was so clearly correct it barely required confirmation. Robert looked at Thomas. Thomas was looking at Sarah with the expression he had first worn in a diner on a cattle road, the expression of a man recalibrating his assessment of another person upward and discovering there was still room to go. "I'll cover the initial costs," Thomas said. Caldwell was already writing. The Bennett Ranch Refuge opened in its formal capacity in the spring of Sarah's 23rd year on a clear April morning with the sky so blue it looked painted and a wind off the plains that smelled of grass and distance and the particular quality of Oklahoma spring that made you believe with complete physical conviction that things could begin again. The property they used was a combination of the Bennett farmhouse and the adjacent acreage, the very land that Garfield had tried to steal, returned to them and now expanded, with 2 additional buildings constructed over the preceding year, one a dormitory for up to 12 children, one a combination schoolroom and common space where Emily held daily sessions with a curriculum she'd developed herself, built on the principle that the first thing a frightened child needed was not pity or programming, but the experience of being expected to grow. There was a stable. Russell ran it with the same wordless competence he applied to everything. Children who arrived frightened learned, as Jacob had learned, that there was something stabilizing about the attention of an animal that did not care about your history and required only your presence and your honesty. There was a garden. Robert tended it with an investment of care that was, Sarah understood, his primary language of amends. The growing of things, the patient work of returning the soil's investment, the daily evidence that something cared for became something sustaining. And there was a kitchen, always warm, always smelling of something on the stove, where every child who arrived, frightened and thin and carrying the particular weight of a situation they hadn't chosen and couldn't yet see the end of, was sat down and given a hot meal before anyone asked them a single question about what had happened to them. This had been Sarah's only non-negotiable in the planning process. Food first, she had said. Always. Before forms, before interviews, before anything official. They eat first. No one had argued, because everyone at that table had been in a diner on a cattle road, or had heard the story enough times to understand it in their bones, and they all knew that the meal had come before the help, and that this had mattered, that the willingness to meet a physical need without conditions or questions had been the thing that made all the subsequent trust possible. A single meal had fed 3 hungry children. Everything that had grown from it, the legal fight, the restored property, the state fraud investigation that had returned land to 11 families, the school, the refuge, the lives of children not yet born who would grow up in a place that existed because of that meal. All of it had begun with a man who stood up from a table and crossed a room and paid for food for 3 children who had not asked him for anything except work. Thomas was 81 when the refuge held its 10th anniversary gathering, and he sat in a chair on the porch of the Bennett farmhouse in the afternoon light and watched the children in the yard. There were 9 of them that year, ranging from 4 to 15, and he looked as he had always looked, solid, unhurried, present, with the quality of stillness that belonged to people who had finished needing to prove anything. Sarah sat beside him. She was 33. She had the same dark eyes she'd always had and the same quality of watchfulness, though it had changed in character over the years. Less the watchfulness of someone calculating threats, and more the watchfulness of someone who paid attention because attention was the primary instrument of care. She had laugh lines now, which Thomas had noticed for the first time a few years prior and had found, privately, one of the best things he'd seen in a long time. She was still keeping notebooks. She was on her 9th. They sat in the afternoon quiet while the children played in the yard, and Robert walked the garden rows with the slow, satisfied pace of a man who had reached a truce with his own past and found the terms acceptable. And Emily's voice carried from the schoolroom. She'd started a lesson, apparently, because Emily had never fully understood that school hours had limits. And somewhere from the stable the sound of Jacob's voice came, low and instructional, as he worked with one of the older children on a horse that was being difficult in the particular way of horses that sensed uncertainty and needed someone to demonstrate the alternative. Thomas said, "I've been thinking about something." "What?" Sarah said. "That afternoon," he said, "at the diner." She looked at him. "I've thought about it many times over the years," he said. "What would have happened if I'd finished my coffee and left? If I'd looked at the situation and decided it wasn't my business?" He paused. "It would have been a defensible decision. Most people would have made it." "Most people did," Sarah said. "We knocked on 9 doors before the diner." "I know." He looked out at the yard. "What I've thought about is that I didn't do it for any large reason. I didn't have a plan. I didn't calculate an outcome. I just saw a situation that was wrong and stood up because sitting down felt worse." Sarah was quiet. "I'm telling you this," Thomas said, "not because I want credit for it. I'm telling you because I want you to know that what you built here," he gestured, a small sweeping gesture that took in the yard and the children and the buildings and the land. "This didn't come from a plan either, not at the beginning. It came from the same thing, seeing what was wrong and deciding that sitting down felt worse." Sarah looked at the yard. At a girl of 12, new, arrived 2 weeks ago, still wearing the careful nothing face that Sarah recognized, who was sitting on the porch steps watching the other children play with the particular assessment eyes of a child who had learned to measure every situation before entering it. As Sarah watched, Jacob's oldest student, a 15-year-old boy named Dion, who had been at the refuge for 2 years and had the easy confidence of someone who had come through something and knew it, walked over to the girl and sat down beside her on the steps and said something Sarah couldn't hear. The girl looked at him sideways. He said something else. She looked back at the yard, and then, slowly, incrementally, in the way that things moved when they were real, she leaned very slightly forward on the steps, and her hands unclenched from her knees, and she watched the other children with something that was not yet ease, but was the first movement in that direction. Sarah watched this. She felt it in the place where she kept the things she'd spent a long time learning to feel without managing them first. "Thomas," she said. Thank you for standing up." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for being worth standing up for," he said. The afternoon light lay long and golden across the yard, the way Oklahoma afternoon light lay in the fall, warm and unhurried and completely without apology for being beautiful after everything. The children's voices rose and fell. Robert straightened up in the garden and put his hand over his eyes to look at something in the east field. Emily's voice from the schoolroom paused, then resumed, then paused again for a question from someone small. In the stable, a horse made a low sound and was answered. Sarah opened her 9th notebook to a blank page. She thought about a girl who had walked down a dusty road with 2 children behind her and knocked on 9 doors that closed and 1 that opened, and she thought about the rancher who had stood up, and she thought about the notebook a teacher had given her because she believed that information was like food. You didn't throw it away just because you weren't hungry right now. She wrote the date at the top of the page. Then she wrote, 10 years, 47 children through these doors, 11 families with land restored, 1 man who stood up. Everything else follows from that. She closed the notebook. She sat beside Thomas on the porch of the house that had nearly been taken from her, on the land that had been fought for and returned, and she watched the girl on the steps lean forward another inch and the boy beside her say something that made the corner of her mouth move. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the beginning of the shape one would eventually make. It was enough. It was, in the particular arithmetic of lives rebuilt from the wreckage of what had been taken, more than enough. The afternoon held them all. The land stayed where it had always been. And the story, which had begun with a meal, and a man who stood up, and a girl who refused to stop walking, continued forward into the lives of children who would carry it without knowing its full weight, the way all of us carry the moments that made us, lightly and completely and without end. The end.